Hello, Edward here from 088. In this session we're going to be talking about macros. Now by macro we just mean the console doing something for you. We're going to be talking about the Flex console predominantly, because on the Flex console you have access to something called fixture macros and also the ability to create your own macros. Now, if you're on Flex S, so a Flex S24 or a Flex S48, you do also have access to the fixture macros. So although this session is predominantly for the full-size Flex console, if you're on Flex S, you're going to be able to benefit from certainly the start of this session when we talk about fixture macros. So let's dive in and start to talk about those. So on my screen here I am running Phantom Zeros. Phantom Zeros allows you to emulate any console running the Zeros software. It allows you to emulate it on your laptop. So for this I am emulating a full-size Flex. You can see its front panel there. Top right of my window I have got capture visualization software running so that we can see what we're doing with our virtual rig. And on the left hand side of my screen here, that is showing me what my external monitor output on my Flex would show me. So, as I said, let's start with fixture macros. First things first, to view the macros window, if you're on Flex, you can just go and hit your dedicated macros button. If you are on Flex S, you can select the lights you need, and then scroll your tabs at the top of your touchscreen all the way along. I'm going to close my external monitor and open my internal touchscreen, and that will look a little bit like this. So if you tap the macro button, it will take your touchscreen to look a little bit like this. And currently the console is saying, well, it's a fresh show, there's no macros currently being created, but there is a button there to allow us to automatically create macros. You'll be very familiar with that button with the groups window, the effects, and also the palettes as well. So if we go and tap automatically create macros, the console is going to look at all of the fixtures that you've currently got patched in. So any fixtures you've currently got added in. So as you can see, I've got some wash fixtures. I've got all sorts of fixtures in my demo file here. And it's pulled a macro in for these fixtures. In my case here, I've got 54 macros that have been created. So what are these at the end of the day? What on earth are these for? Well, with more complex fixtures, they're going to have additional functions that you can trigger. And we can see some of these terms here. You've got things like global reset, lamp off. We've also got things in here like curves, the ability to change the dimmer curve of the fixture. Now, quite often, to be able to change these functions of the fixture remotely, you need to set certain control parameters to certain levels, and quite often for a certain amount of time. Now, to reduce the amount of time you need to consult your fixtures manual to look at all of that information is stored in a palette. So in the case of any of these, let's take the global reset. This will have in it the information for the particular control value required, the control parameter, and also the amount of time that the value needs to be held at that level. Now, in the case of things like lamp off, reset, you might need multiple parameters to go to certain levels, and that's why the macros are really useful. It avoids you needing to look at your fixtures manual, dive through your pages of beam controls to look for the parameter you need. You can just use the fixture macro in here. Just like other palettes, the way you would use them is you select the lights you need, and you can then use one of the fixture macros to send that instruction to the light. They're displayed in here in alphabetical order. In your macros window, they will be displayed in alphabetical order to help you find the one you need. For the purpose of this, let's have a play with one. I'm going to take my lighting state down that I had playing there. I'm going to move my internal touchscreen here, and I'm just going to go and open my external monitor. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and tap a question mark, and that will open the system info window on your Q's desktop. And I'm going to go to the DMX outputs, and we can now see our raw DMX outputs that we're sending to our fixture, and I can filter by universe. Now the really nice thing about macros is they just work. You don't get any pop-up, they're just going to run when you trigger them. So an example of that, I'm going to go and select my group 11 lights. I'm going to go to macros to view the macros here. And I'm going to go and then send it a reset. And notice in my DMX output that sent a level on the relevant control parameter. I don't need to care what one it is. It sent the reset instruction, and when it's finished sending that command, it will automatically set those levels back to default. As you can see there, they just all flashed back down to 0 again. And so that just happened. We didn't need to worry about that. We just tapped on macro, the console did the work. It knew the parameters, the levels, and the amount of time. Taking that a step further, we can also use really useful lamp on macros. So if you go scroll through and you find a lamp on macro, so literally a macro that's displayed as lamp on, just like that, the console will automatically stagger that instruction across your fixtures. So if you were to select a group of lights, say lamp on, rather than all of those lamps turning on at once, which could lead to overcurrent, instead the console will automatically stagger that for you. So let's take a look at this one. I'm currently got my LED fixtures selected. Well, they don't have a lamp on macro because they're LED. So instead I'm going to go and select some discharge fixtures. So I'm going to go and say 1 through 6, enter. I could have used the channel buttons to select those lights as well. I'm going to go back to viewing my DMX outputs, and these fixtures are on universe 3. So let's just dive in and take a look at universe 3. So now I've done that, I'm going to go and send my lamp on command and watch those values in my DMX outputs. I'm going to go lamp on and notice how it staggers these across my fixtures. I've selected all of those lights at once, but rather than all of those changing at once, you can see the console is just working through each fixture. It's working through, staggering them, sending that lamp on instruction one by one. And when it's finished doing that, there we go, we're back to default. So the console sent the lamp on instruction to each fixture in turn automatically. So that is fixture macros. Simple as that. That's what they're there for. They will all be pulled in no matter what flex range console you're on. The console, depending of course on what lights you've got currently patched, you can have a maximum of 240 fixture macros. So quite a comprehensive library of just various functions that you can scroll through. And as I said, with all of that information built into those macros. So that's it for fixture macros. So if you're for Flex S, I'm afraid that's all we're going to cover for that, because if you're on the full-size Flex, we're now going to dive in and start to talk about programming custom macros. That is a Flex-only feature. So I'm going to go and close my DMX outputs window. And I'm going to go and close the internal touchscreen for now. So what do we record with our custom macros? When we say create a custom macro, what are we actually recording? Well, we can record syntax strings. So by that we mean anything that gets typed into our command line. That can be recorded as a macro. Or we can choose to record any physical button presses on our console. So those are kind of the two things that you can record. And so, of course, in terms of syntax strings, you could record that just purely to save yourself some time. So recording a syntax string, saving you having to type that string out regularly if you use it often. You could use a macro just to save yourself some time there. But kind of the other element of where macros are useful is just purely as a pool, a location if you like, of things on the console that can get triggered. Because your macros can get triggered by all sorts of different methods on your console. We're going to explore those in this session. So by that I mean queues can trigger macros, UDKs can trigger macros. You could actually map MIDI commands, remote switches, keyboard hotkeys. We're going to explore all of those. But it's just worth bearing in mind that the macros window isn't just there to allow you to recall the macros. Actually, it's just kind of a holding area as a location where actually these macros can get triggered from other methods. So let's talk about how we can actually record one then, how we can record a custom macro. Recording custom macros is different to recording everything else on the console. Normally, when you're recording things on the console, you create what you want first. It's the other way round when it's macros. First, you actually start things off by tapping record. Tap record, and you've now got two options. If you're already viewing the macros window, you can scroll on down and choose any empty macro marked with an asterisk. And you can just literally click on the touchscreen. Alternatively, you can use syntax. So I could say record macro, and then I can define the macro number. So I could say record macro 61, enter, for example. And we're now going to get this pop up here. And the console is saying, what would you like to record in this macro? Are we recording physical button presses, or are we just concentrating on the command line? This is what I mentioned earlier. It's that choice of whether you're just literally recording physical button presses, could be playback buttons, could be any physical button, or are we just concentrating on recording a syntax string that's getting typed into your command line? Well, we can do an example of both. Let's do a command line first of all. Let's do an example commands macro. If I choose commands right now, you'll see it's kind of pre-selected, it's highlighted, so I could just hit my enter key and that would also go ahead and choose commands. When I do that, my macro LED is going to blink at me. My console is now waiting for button pushes. And any button pushes I do, anything I type into my command line now will be getting recorded into your macro. So if you do make a mistake, it's worth just stopping and re-recording it, okay? Because anything you type in now is getting recorded in there. So let's do an example, and if you've been on previous sessions when I've spoken about this, this is one I always like to use. It's just a good example, and something that you might actually use to save you a bit of time. And that is to record yourself what we call a blocked blackout. So by blocked blackout, we mean that you're telling every fixture in your console to go to 0, and you're then recording that in as a cue. So if you wish to do that, I'm going to go and say 1 through at dot. 1 through is selecting everything, at dot is telling it to go to 0, and I'm then going to go and say record enter. Now if you do a record enter, you're recording the current lighting state information into the currently viewed playback. Not only that, you're storing in as the next available cue in the currently viewed playback. Now I've done that, that's the syntax string I wanted. I can go ahead and now click my macro button. And we've now stopped recording our macro. All of that information is now stored in my macro tile here. So, in my case here now, I'm going to go and actually record a cue. So I'm going to go and say, for example, 49 through 58. I'm going to turn those lights on. You can see they're on in my visualizer. Let's put them in a position. Let's put them in a colour. I'm now going to go and record that as my cue onto my master playback. And now, let's say I know, right, my next queue needs to be a blackout. Well, saving me having to type in that syntax string, I can use my macro. Clicking on my macro sends those lights to 0 and records that as a queue for me. Because I use record enter, it's recorded it in as the next available queue number. I could, of course, I could have recorded that macro saying record to enter. And doing that will have always forced that queue to be recorded in as queue number 2. Whereas how I've done it here, because I've just done record enter, it's just going to go as the next available whole queue number in the currently viewed playback. It means I can reuse that macro. And so we can see there it's starting to save us some time. Something that you're always going to want to do, no matter what you do on the console, always name stuff. Same applies when it comes to macros. If you wish to name a macro, tap name and give your macro a tap. Or you could use a bit more of a syntax method. You could say macro61 name. And I'm going to go and say blackout, because that records my blackout queue for me. Now, taking that a step further, I can avoid needing to go into the macros window. Of course, if you're starting to program a lot of these macros, it's going to start to take you time to kind of look through the macros window, or you're going to have to start remembering the macro number. And so instead, we can actually assign a macro onto a UDK. So on your console, you've got your 4 UDKs here. By default, they are page locked. And that means that no matter what playback page you're on, those 4 UDKs, are going to always do the same thing. If you wanted to, you could turn page lock off, and that would mean that they would page with the playback pages. So you'd actually end up with 40 UDKs across the 10 pages. So that's just worth bearing in mind if you want to use more of, get access to more of these UDK functions. For this though, I'm going to stick my blackout macro onto UDK number 2. And to do that, I can use the syntax macro and type the number of the macro. Now, in my case here, I numbered it macro61, as we can see. So I can use the syntax macro61, tap record, and you'll notice I've tapped record, but my console isn't flashing at me. Usually when you tap record, the console's playback buttons will be flashing away at you. But in my case here, the console knows that I'm not recording channel data. Instead, it knows that I'm recording a shortcut. So I can say macro61 record, and I'm then going to actually go and tap UDK number 2. And we can see there that has now put macro61 on that UDK. So if this time, again, I've gone in, let's grab those lights again. Let's turn those on. We're going to have those in red this time. We're going to have those in a different position. And I'm going to go and record that as my next available queue. I now need a blackout as my next queue. I can just go ahead and tap my UDK. And that now records my next queue as a blackout for me. That's just one example, of course, of what we could use our macros for. Let's do another one this time. Let's do another example. And this time we'll do a keys example. Now, another really useful use of macros is to automatically do things on the console for us as we run through our queues. Now, we've looked at how we can trigger macros from our UDKs. We can also trigger macros from our queues. And of course, macros are a brilliant way of being lazy. And so let's say it, for example, that when I got to Q3, I need to access some lighting states that are on my next page of playbacks. Maybe in cues 1, 2 and 3, I'm going in and manually adding in some lighting states over the top using my faders. But when I get to cue 3, I know actually I need to access stuff that's on the next page. Well, save you having to remember to do that in the heat of the moment, we could program a macro to automatically change our page number. So let's do that now. Again, same process. I'm going to say record macro. I'm going to record this in as macro 62. So I'm going to go and say record macro 62, enter. And this time I want a key. Reason for that is the page up and page down buttons do not appear in your syntax command line. Page up and page down, they just are physical keys. They're not part of your syntax. So I'm going to go and say, yep, I want to record keys. And I'm now going to go and say page up and finish recording my macro. Again, I'm going to name that. So I'm going to say name macro 62, enter. And I'm actually going to call that page up. And now what I can do, now I've done that, is I'm going to go into the settings of Q3. So I'm going to go and click add next to Q3. I'm going to go macros ... And usually when you come in here, this is where you go to trigger or release queue stacks. Really common if you're triggering or releasing chases from a queue, for example. But in our case here, we're going to go macros. And I can now see every macro in my console. And I can see my 2 custom macros here. And so I can go and trigger page up. That's now in there for me. And I can click OK. Now, if you wish to, just a little tip to be aware of, if you wish to trigger multiple macros to save you having to go through and add lots at a time, go through that process, go to advanced and you can actually type in some syntax into here. So let's say that I wanted macros 1, 2, 3 and 62 to be triggered in this queue. I could go M1, semicolon, M2, semicolon, M3, semicolon. And that's now going to be triggering all of those macros from this queue. Just to be aware of. In my case here, I'm going to click cancel on that because I just want macro 62. Click OK on the macros window, click OK on the settings window, and I now get, might be a little bit small for you, but I can now see I've got macro 62 displayed in my settings button. So let's run through those queues. There's Q1, which was a blackout to start us off. Go into Q2, I've got my lighting state there. Go into Q3 and watch my page display. I automatically change to page 2. Let's do that again, but this time viewing the faders window. I'm now going to go into my next queue. And my faders automatically page up. Another really good use of your macros. Another macro that you might want to think about using is another way of automatically triggering your macro from a queue. Now, I've got a lighting state here on my fader. And let's say that when I push that up, I want to automatically be able to change the colour of the cyc using my internal touchscreen. So I want to be able to bring up that playback and automatically get my colour controls appear on the internal touchscreen. Well, of course, at the moment, what I could do is I could go and select those fixtures, 69 through 76 in my case. I could then go to colour. And I could then, of course, access the colour controls. But to save me having to do that each time I want to do it, I can save that as a macro. And I can then get that macro to be triggered by that playback itself. So let's do an example now. This time, I'm going to say record macro 63, enter. And again, this time I am actually going to be recording commands. That's now recording. So I'm now going to go and say 69 through 76, enter to select those, and I'm then going to hit my colour button so that my colour controls appear on my internal touchscreen. I'm now going to press macro to stop recording that. I'm going to name that. So I'm going to say macro 63 name, and I'm going to go and say psych colours for this one. And what I can do now is I'm now going to go and view playback number 1. So press and hold view, tap playback number 1's button. And just like we had for all of the cues in our master playback, I have a settings button. So I could go and say settings, add some settings, add a macro, and I can then go and choose my psych colours macro. Click OK, click OK. And now, and I'm going to open my internal touchscreen so that it's a little bit easier for us, I'm going to raise that playback fader, and automatically as I do that, my colour controls are displayed on my internal touchscreen for me. And so I can now go and change the colour of my psych. So let's do another example. Let's do that again. Double tap clear. Pull that fader down. Push the fader up. I can then straight away use the colour picker. So another example that you might want to use there is just the ability to, if you've got various lighting states, the ability for that lighting state to essentially grab those fixtures for you and take you straight to the colour controls. Equally, I could have done another macro that selects my wash fixtures here and puts my effect controls on the encoder wheel, so I could straight away dive in there, adjust the speed, the size, the offset of that effect as well. Something that you can do as well is you can go in and out of setup in for when you're recording macros. So you could have, for example, a macro that changed a setting within setup. You could go into a queue, it automatically takes you into setup, makes the change, comes back out. To do that, I'll just quickly show you. You can when you tap the setup key, you'll notice that when you arrow up and down, you get a little halo around the button that's highlighted. So I could go around, choose the option I need, hit enter to go to that tab. I could then use my up and down arrows again to navigate that. And I could then go and enter in, and I can now change my streaming ACN priority. So you could have a macro that changed the priority of your streaming ACN, for example. Loads of different things you can do. You can see there are just many different ways that you can use the macros. So you could have a macro that changed the streaming ACN priority. You could configure that and exit setup again. And again, if I wanted to, I could stick that on UDK 3 and 4, so I could have a high priority and a low priority setting. So if you've got multiple consoles controlling the same rig, you can easily switch between which one has control. Loads of different options. I'm just using some basic examples here. Looking at the macros window then, let's open my internal touchscreen. So we've looked in here at how we can record, we've looked at naming. We can also copy as well. That's useful if you want to rearrange the macro tiles in the macro window. So if I want to copy macro 63 to macro 65, I could use the syntax macro 63, copy 65, enter. And that's going to give me an exact copy. To delete a macro, exactly like pretty much anything else on the console, tap delete, give it a tap, and you can confirm. Or again, I could use the syntax macro 65 delete, and you could then confirm that way. I'm going to go and say yes. So that's naming. We've looked at deleting. We've looked at copying. The last thing just to be aware of is there are settings for a macro. To access a macro settings, hold setup and tap it, or you can actually use the syntax macro63 setup. And you've just got the option to play it back fast or slow. So fast, it's just going to instantly rerun that string of keys. If I run this back slow, you can see there that it's just going to type that in much slower, kind of more at the speed you might have typed it in. So you've got that level of control if you need that. Great stuff. So that is our different macro types there of keys and commands and some different uses that we've explored for them there. We've spoken about the ways that we can trigger these. So we've spoken about the fact that we can use, well, directly in the macros window, we can click on those. We can use syntax, so you could just literally go, for example, macro61 enter, and that's going to recall that. So it's now giving me the option to, of course, record that blackout onto playback 1. I'm going to click cancel on that though for now. So you can just tap in on the macro window. I could use the syntax macro number enter. We've looked at how we can trigger macros from queues. We've looked at UDKs. Something to be aware of is because you can trigger macros from queues, like we did here, that means you can also trigger macros from MIDI. Because you could have a dedicated playback of essentially queues that don't actually record control lighting themselves. You could just record a completely blank queue. So if I tapped record, tapped an empty playback now, I've recorded that onto playback 2, you can see I've just got a completely blank queue. That's not going to control any lights. But it could still control a macro. So that means that if I triggered this playback from MIDI, could be MIDI notes, I could do that from MIDI timecode as well if I wanted to. Rather than actually triggering a lighting state, I could actually use MIDI to trigger a macro. So again, you can probably start to think of all of the various uses that you could use for that. I'm not going to cover MIDI in this session, but MIDI is configured within triggers. So within triggers, you can choose whether you want timecode, notes, or show control. So worth clarifying, MIDI can trigger macros via queues. Now, where you can trigger macros natively is using the remote switches. So on the rear of FLX, you have got a little D sub 9 connector, and that allows you to wire in 8 close contact switches. And at the point of that switch being shorted to the common pin, so the action of a switch being flicked, you can have that switch either triggering a particular queue number or indeed a particular macro number. So uses for remote switches, well, of course, you could have that as an actual light switch on stage. When a performer flicks it, it does actually trigger a cue on the console. Or you could make yourself a button panel. You could have a remote button panel. You could make yourself some foot switches. You know, there's lots of different things that you can do when it comes to creating your own remote switches. And they can then trigger these macros or your particular queue. Now, if remote switch 1, let's say that I want remote switch 1 each time I tap that to advance through my queues, you would have to use a macro for that. Because of course, go to queue, each time I tapped my remote switch, it would just be triggering the same queue number each time. So if you want to use a remote switch to actually advance through queues, record yourself a macro of literally just the go button being pressed. So you just record a macro of pressing one of the go button you need, and then you can have your remote switch triggering that particular macro that you've created. So that would be one way of doing it. Now, taking that a step further, the remote switches are mapped to Control F1 through Control F8 on your keyboard. So that means, and I can use those keyboard shortcuts with a keyboard connected to my console, with Phantom Xeros as I am now, or via the Xeros Monitor app for Windows. So you could remotely trigger macros using that keyboard shortcuts via the remote apps if you needed to remotely control some functions. Now, the remote switches themselves, you can of course configure these to trigger whatever macro I want. So let's say that I wanted to do my page up macro, which was number 62 from memory. And this is saying now, okay, well, when I send a remote switch 1 or a control F1, that's going to be triggering macro 62. And so now I can go and say a control F1. I'm doing control F1 on my laptop now, and hopefully you can see that is indeed advancing my faders, because that is just literally triggering macro 62, which I defined as page up. So although you can't customize the keyboard shortcuts, you couldn't, for example, make the letter R do something else, that will always be record. Well, you do have Control F1 through to Control F8 that you can customize. And you can customize those by using macros that can then be triggered via the remote switches. The last thing to mention when it comes to macros is another way that macros can be triggered is from ICANN if you've got the architectural version of Xeros Server. So if you've got Xeros Server, that can also, you can input ICANN, the ICANN protocol into that, and if it receives a particular scene number in from ICANN, you can also map that to macros as well. So that would mean, you know, you could have literally a remote, a button panel somewhere in your venue that controlled your architectural lighting, but also triggered a macro on your console. And that is everything I wanted to cover. So I hope you found that useful. We've gone in depth there into all of the various functions that you can do with macros. I've just used some examples that I've chosen to use. Of course, as you can see, there's all sorts of things that you can do with these macros. So I hope you found that useful. Do have a play with them. Drop us an email. Let us know how you get on if you've got any questions at all. And we'll see you on the next session. Thank you for joining.